recent leaking of a quite significant roster move in the Dota 2 world, in the pro scene, actually provoked some thoughts within me about a certain kind of conundrum that can sometimes happen. In this case, for the team who's actually acquiring the star names. And so what happened was Evil Genius players RTZ and Zai have moved over to Team Secret, and they were both very successful players at their positions in Evil Geniuses. And to the layman, this looks like a great talent acquisition. You know, the sort of person who they just know the names, that they're not so keyed into the metagame or the roles people play. They'll look at the names and they'll say, oh, you're stacking up all these great names and really good players. Like, this is only going to make the team better and these players are going to be more successful. But actually, this immediately causes a bunch of potential problems. The first problem, you bring over RTZ, the big name, considered a star player, one of the best Western players. Some people would say the best Western player. You look at this player, and for Evil Geniuses, he was playing mid. Yeah, he's a carry, but he was playing in the mid position. Well, Team Secret already have one of the most famous Western mids, S4, obviously famed for his time in Alliance there. And so between the two of them, well, only one person out of the two can play that carry mid role. So it's going to have to be a choice. Who's it going to be? Now, the consensus among experts is that despite RTZ's recent excellent form and great results in Evil Geniuses, S4 is considered the better mid. Historically, he's the greater mid. He's considered the better mid perhaps in terms of suiting the role. But that was the way Evil Geniuses was using RTZ, was in that mid role. So immediately you end up with a situation where one must assume, speculating on what we know now, that the initial move will actually be to move RTZ from mid to the hard carry role. He'll have to go instead over and play that, while S4 retains the mid slot. So then that has a knock-on effect, because now what happens to the guy who was playing that role? That was Kuroki. Now Kuroki will have to switch into the off lane. So now, not only do you have the factor of, okay, S4 stays mid, RTZ moves to the other carry role, and now Kuroki moves to the offlane. Now you have to ask, not only how does RTZ do here, but what happens to Kuroki when he goes up to this position here? Because Kuroki had been playing very well. He was actually quite praised and lauded for his ability to have played this position, different to how he'd played in the past in Na'Vi in certain times. So there's a chain reaction potentially happening here, where it's not just about how will one player play better here or how will one player play in this team, but it's how will one player play within the context of how he used to play, how a teammate will now have to play differently, and how they used to play in the previous. So it's going to be this whole mixing pot of potential problems, trying to figure out how to make this a better situation for everyone, or just for the team as a whole, even if one person has to give up some level of effectiveness or impact or shine that they had before. What's interesting about this scenario is you could break it down, if you're a Dota 2 expert, which I'm not, just on that level of how will RTZ play here and how will Kuroki play here. But actually, what I want to bring up as a general topic is what I call the star player fallacy. And it's something I've seen in sports, and I've seen in esports particularly, over and over, which usually goes like this. The simplest version to explain, I'll have to start with a European sport first, which is football, which is that I think this principle holds in esports games as well. In general, people who start to play always want to have what is usually considered the hardest, but the most skillful and the most game impactful role. And so in football, that's to be the striker, to get to score the goals. And so every boy growing up initially tries to play the striker role. They want to be the striker. They want to score the goals. That's considered the most fun. And within games, likewise, if you're playing Counter-Strike or something, you want to be the main fragger who's put in the position to have the best chance to get the kills, because that's the most fun, to get the kills. That's the raw, fun skill component of the game. Likewise, in MOBA games, you want to be the carry. You want to be the guy who he gets all the farm, he gets every item he wants, he gets all the protection, all the peel, and then he's going to carry the whole game. That's naturally what the best, most skilled players will go towards. And so as a result, it's a fact actually that a lot of pro players do have an inherent bias in how they judge other players and other positions on the basis that they think to themselves, well, certain positions take more skill, and therefore, in general, the best players are going to be that position, and then this player here, yeah, he might be incredible at that, but he probably wishes he did this one, or whatever, along those lines. And so, within the football context I gave there, it's true that actually a lot of people who end up being amazing defenders, yeah, at one point in time, they might have actually realized, oh, my skill set's better suited to being a defender and all the rest of it. But there's a degree to which a lot of the defensive roles come out of realizing that you're not going to be effective at the carry, the more skilled roles in the football context. And I think likewise, that's to a degree how it develops, except for strange people who just maybe do have a very cerebral mind, or they naturally their personality is more supportive. It's true, there'll be exceptions. And so the reason why I bring this up is because it gives this inherent kind of bias that I've always noticed in star players, especially in esports games, but even in real sports, which is that the guy who plays the hardest, the most skillful, the most game impactful role will then take as like a knock-on effect in terms of how he logically processes how the game works. He'll think to himself, well, if I play the hardest, most game impactful, most important role, then that means I could also play all the other roles if I wanted, or I could play like the next hardest role, or I could play the next second most difficult role, or the second most game impactful role. If I can do this harder thing, then I can do this easier thing, which by the way doesn't follow whatsoever. The best striker in the world in football, to give the most extreme example, could not probably play goalkeeper. He wouldn't be very good. But in this particular case, as long as we make it a small difference like that, there's probably some truth to it. Like a lot of these players, because they're so skillful, and a lot of them have very good either conscious game knowledge or intuitive game knowledge from having played the game for so long, they probably can actually do that role. They probably can be good at it. It just depends what is the context that we're judging them from. Because if we're judging them against average pro players at that role that they're moving to now, then actually amazing, like godlike sort of elite level players at the really hard role, the really carry dependent role, probably could do the second carry role. That's probably accurate actually. They probably could even be much better than the average pro level player. Or even if they didn't have all the skills and they weren't adapted initially, they'd have enough strengths, enough skills, enough impact, enough sense for how to play otherwise, or an counterintuitive style coming from their different role, that as a result they would still be better in some senses and they could be a better player. Judged against themselves at the previous role. Now here's where it gets interesting. So we're not just judging them at the new role against most players who play that. We're now judging them at the new role versus them at their old role, which was initially their best role, they're most suited for. Now here's where it starts to break down a bit. In general, as a rule, you can say, except for certain exceptional players, often possessed with a sort of genius or kind of savants for the game, in general, as a hard and fast rule, you can usually say that judged against themselves at their kind of true role, their natural role, their role that they've fit, that they've played and crafted for so long, odds are they're not going to be as good, and in many cases they're going to be much worse. Now, aside from cases where they're going to be much worse, they'll probably be, their best case scenario is probably to be almost as good as the original role, but it's unlikely they will get to that level, not least because of time of experience and all the rest of it. And if they're not naturally as suited to that, then perhaps there'll be frustrations there or issues where they have to learn a new skill, and there's nothing to say that they can develop those extra skills or play impactfully without having certain other benefits of, in terms of mobile, where you are placed on the map, what support you get, etc. In terms of his previous role now, let's use the RTZ example. In EG, RTZ's played this hard carrier role, but he was playing it from the mid lane, and playing from the mid lane, EG's particular setup, which was all about him, and he was going to be the hard carry that won the game for them. That's why he's so praised and so lauded by fans in the West. His particular positioning in the mid lane actually gave him, to a degree, more room to play in terms of like not having to worry as much about being ganked, or being able to get more protection, or the team being able to focus more on ensuring he wasn't getting ganked, he wasn't getting shut down, he wasn't getting stopped from becoming that super farm intensive hard carry that would win the whole game for them. In terms of judged against himself, it's hard to see how he'll have a lot of those benefits and a lot of the same degree of impact that he maybe had in Evil Geniuses in this new team. Now then, listen, maybe he doesn't have to have it. Maybe S4 being such a great mid laner, that'll be great there, and he'll, like I say, maybe he'll be better than most of the other pros and even the majority of the pros at this new position, that it won't matter. But the question is, what about if RTZ isn't as impactful within the game itself? Will that cause issues? Will that be an issue for RTZ himself? Will that cause motivation problems for him? Will that cause performance issues where if you're having the bad game, then you feel as though like, what if I was playing that other position? I know what I could have done there. There's all sorts of issues here. Now we're asking questions like what's good for the player and what's good for the team, and will the two be able to find synergy and interaction in terms of how they work? Now there's another context that we have to consider, and this is even more vital, especially for great players, because great players have this ego, this sense of confidence that comes from knowing. The reason they don't doubt themselves is they know they're better, and they know that if they get put in position to succeed versus the other, even the best player in the world, they feel like they have a chance, they can do it. But the problem is when they're in situations that aren't as ideal, or there's problems, or they're having an issue here, or they maybe even wistfully think of something they had before. Now there's extra factors that then if you don't succeed, maybe you doubt yourself, or you question the situation, or did I make the right decision, or what's going on here? So the other context you have to consider is, now consider that player who switched role compared to the best players at that new role. So the elite godlike players at his new role. Now again, in this particular case, it's very likely the player switching will not be as good as those players. Because those players, that is their natural law, that is their strength, that is their craft, that is what makes them amazing, is everything that's good about them. Has a logic, has a sense to how it works in that role. So it's unlikely, even if this good player switches, even if he becomes phenomenal, becomes very close to his old level or even similar, it's actually quite unlikely he'll be as good as the best at that role. It's just very unlikely that people can be the best at multiple roles in that sense. So in that particular scenario, obviously there's context here about the players and teams that we have to take into mind. Like, I don't think that Team Secret made this move without being aware of this and then just found out like, oh, wait a minute, we got 2 mid lane. Shit, yeah, we only need 1. Like, no, I imagine they knew this, especially because it's well known that within the circle of friends within Dota 2, S4 and RTZ know each other, friends, played together. So presumably they've even played games where S4 went mid and RTZ was just the carry. That all makes perfect sense. I'm sure it probably even worked. But again, that's working within a fun game or working within a semi-pro game. That's not the same as like, well, now my life is dedicated to I'm only this one. I'm not going to be the mid anymore. I'm not going to be put in that position. I'm not going to have everything built around me anymore. And now I'm just going to live the rest of my life. Well, can the player be as happy there? Can he be as successful? Can he be as impactful? Does he need to be within the context of the team? These are interesting questions to ask. And I would hope people who are experts about Dota can take this and kind of spin their own thoughts off and actually try and speculate some of these things and give some answers and kind of predict where this might go so that we can see in the future as it plays out, like, oh, does it match up to any of these factors? I've got some sports examples of this scenario of like players switching positions and it not being as good or impactful. So I've got a really good example that I'm going to use for this particular one for the Evil Geniuses players going to Team Secret example, because it's a multiple example that caused all these knock-on effects that likewise on paper initially looked awesome. So what happened was in basketball in the NBA in the mid-90s, it was in 1996 I believe was the year this happened. Let me think. 96. It might have been 97. It's 96 or 97. Charles Barkley, one of the best players of all time, one of the greatest power forwards, which is the 4 position in the NBA. He moved from the Phoenix Suns over to the Houston Rockets. And the Houston Rockets had won the championship a couple of years in 94 and 95. And moving over there was because his body was breaking down a bit. He was getting towards the end of his career. So he wasn't like a super hard carry dominant player that he was a couple of years earlier. And over on the Houston Rockets, here's the key thing. They had 2-star players who likewise were getting on in years and couldn't just be the one godlike single player that you sometimes get when they're in the physical prime of the NBA who can just carry a whole team to a championship, like Hakeem Olajuwon had on the first championship they'd had. So he moves over and these 2-star players the Houston Rockets have was Clyde Drexler, shooting guard, and Hakeem Olajuwon, who, I mean, technically he probably should be a power forward, but with the way the NBA works and the lack of true centers, he would usually play the 5 position. He would play the hard center. And so the problem was, on paper, this was an awesome looking move because all the stars thought to themselves, awesome, now I've got 2 other guys who've played the star role. Like we can like share the load and together, what if all 3 of us are going off in a game? Like they won't be able to beat us, man. We'll be great. This is our chance to win a ring together. And if you were a fan, likewise, you thought like, oh my God, we've got 3 players who like had been on all-star teams. They would have been on Olympic level teams years earlier, like amazing looking names on paper. The problem was when you actually got down to the basketball, the X's and O's of how basketball works, this actually turned out to be a very flawed trade because the bigger thing that they hadn't considered, and this might sound naive because like I said with the Evil Genius example, I don't think they really did just think like, yeah, we got RTZ, cool. Wait a minute, doesn't he play mid? Yeah, what's the problem? Don't you play mid S4? Shit. Like, obviously I was being a bit facetious, just joking there. But actually that sort of scenario is what happened in this team. Because the way the basketball court is set up, Charles Barkley and Hakeem Olajuwon were both players who always operated on the left-hand block, on the left-hand side, down low, near the basket. That was their office. That was where they'd spent the majority of their careers, putting in those 20,000 points and whatever, 5,000, 10,000 rebounds, whatever each of them had. That was their office. That's where they'd worked their whole career. That was the best position for them to be most successful. And so if you think of Charles Barkley, you see him on the left side of the block, starting at the top of the key, and then he gets the pass thrown into him. Then crucially, Charles Barkley's most famous for he would back the defender down as much as he could, then turn around and take a shot, and if he missed, he would get the rebound and go for a shot again. That was his whole style. And if he doesn't go for the shot like that, he's going to throw it back out again, but then he's going to try and take a deeper position, or he's going to go for the rebound when the shooter misses. That's his whole style of play. Hakeem Olajuwon, you see him on the left side. He's working. He's got all those post moves. He's going to the basket. He throws back out for the shooter. Again, here's the problem. They both want to be in the same position on the floor. Clyde Drexler, now he's not a down and low player. He's a perimeter player. But as a perimeter player, he often used to like to go left a lot. He used to go to the left side of the floor. He needs the lane to be open so that he can slash to the basket, so that he can have an inside and an outside game and not just have to shoot threes all the time. So the problem here is all three players want to some degree, get something from the left side of the floor that can't exist at the same time for all three. In fact, it can only exist for one at a time. And that's what the Houston Rockets had to do. What they would literally do was just take turns. Like Barkley would go down low, he'd take some throws like that and then go on. And then he'd try that a couple of times if it seemed to be working. And then they'd send Olajuwon down to that point. And when Olajuwon and Barkley weren't doing that, they would literally be stood off to a different part of the court where they weren't as effective, they didn't play normally. Primarily not getting the ball, and they'd just sort of watch the other guy, like, you're taking your turn, good shot, Sharp, yeah, now it's my turn, and then he would go down there, and then other times, Clyde Drexler would get his effectiveness, and what they had to do during these couple of years was try to figure out the right moments to give the right person a chance and this sort of thing. Now, in general, they managed to make it work a bit. Like, they made it to the Western Conference Final their first year together. That was like a solid result, but they never won a championship together. They never were that even more effective, more than the sum of its parts sort of scenario that everyone hoped and dreamed for when you saw that lineup put together on paper. It never happened for them. And crucially, in basketball, at least in basketball, you were able to sort of get a workaround, which was that because there's literally one ball and it can only go to one person at a time, you could literally rotate people into that position, let him have a shot, then rotate the other one. And that's not ideal basketball. Ideal basketball is that every person on the floor should be in their ideal position and as a result should be a threat. That way, when you get double teamed over this side by two defenders, you throw the ball to the open man and he's not in his ideal position and he can either cause more pressure with another pass or he can take a shot open and get a better shot. That the fundamental team concept didn't work, but you could make the star player aspect work to a degree. Now, the problem in a game like Dota, obviously, is that's very unlikely that's going to happen. Now, maybe Team Secret will do that. Maybe some games they would rotate RTZ into the mid. Maybe they'd have him play for a certain point. It seems unlikely, though, and it seems unlikely in general as a principle. You can do it. You definitely won't be able to do that with Kuroki. He's not going to go back to his old position. That seems like it's almost certainly not going to happen. So that's a problem. Another sports example, I'll use one player now, and this one's a little bit tricky because like I said with the Olajuwon example where he's always listed as like a power forward, but technically, yeah, he would actually be listed as a center because there weren't many true centers, so he would always play that within the role because you have to pick the 5 positions in basketball actually as well. Likewise, another player where that happened with is on paper, you'd want Pau Gasol to be like a stretch 4, to be your power forward. Because he's not like a really dominant physical type of center who wants to play super close to the basket. He has a decent mid-range shot and he has some good post moves. And crucially, he can shoot a little bit more long range than some of them come. He has good free throw shooting and he can pass. So in general, you'd want him in an ideal world to be this stretch 4. But actually, instead, his best success, because of the lack of true centers, came playing the center role. And so when he was on the Lakers and their center was this young guy, Andrew Bynum, and he kept getting injured all the time, would just put Pau Gasol at the center and they'd run everything through him inside out. And then Kobe Bryant would be the outside perimeter player and he would be the inside player. And they had awesome synergy and they went to 3 finals in a row together. They won 2 NBA championships together. And Pau Gasol was quite clearly the second best player on that team. He played his role really effectively. Well, in the 2 years after they won the title, they had Andrew Bynum for the first 2 years, was developing more as a player and he was less injured. And he was a true center. So they tried putting him as the center all the time. And what happened was Pau Gasol's role became much more diminished and he wasn't as effective and he clearly had problems even in terms of mentality of how to play and his synergy wasn't as good with other players. He was still decent. And so they were giving that up, thinking, well, if this Bynum guy becomes incredible and becomes really good, it doesn't matter that Pau Gasol's a little bit worse. He can be a little bit worse, but this guy will be even better and we'll be better as a team. Now that ended up not happening because actually they had some better aspects from the center, but the team didn't flow the same way. It didn't work as well. And crucially, crucially, then they traded Pau Gasol. They got Dwight Howard in there. Now, this is another true center. This guy hasn't got a mid-range jump shot. This guy isn't very good at free throw. He has to be in those positions to do that. So as a result, they put him in the place, and it was even worse, actually. The synergy was even worse. And so, unfortunately, they actually kind of fucked their team up to a degree. And crucially, they fucked Pau Gasol up a bit, because actually what you saw was they used Pau Gasol in this way where everyone just assumed that, oh, he wasn't good anymore. And then eventually, now he's gone to the Bulls, and now he's fucking balling out of control again. Now he's really awesome. He's totally back in the flow of it. He's being used as that core role. He's playing fucking amazing. He's playing on a team with like a power forward, Joakim Noah, who plays that, so he can play the 5, and it all works again. And so these might seem a bit abstract as sporting examples, but the idea with all sorts of examples is if you don't know the game, then you can use the sport example to get into the concept of what I'm talking about, or you can go the other way and use the game to get into the sporting aspect. And so I see a lot of potential problems coming out here, and I understand why players do this. It's a gamble that can pay off, for sure. Like I say, RTZ doesn't have to be as good if that's the direction they go that he swaps away. But now you've got all these factors. Now what happens to RTZ? What happens to Kuroki? Now, does that put more pressure on S4's play? Like if S4 has 2 months where he's not playing as well or not as effectively as RTZ did in EG, will the temptation be to swap him out? Will there be more pressure on him? And people saying, oh, you ruined RTZ's career. Like he could have done this, that, the other. There's a lot of potential problems that could arise from this. Nothing at the moment because we haven't seen what happened. But I think this is some potentially interesting food for thought. And I'd like to hear what other people think of this. How does this fit their understanding of the metagame, and who can swap what role and make it as effective, or do they need to be as effective?